Had the opportunity, especially along Rockwell, where there were some issues revolving around perhaps, and I saw it happen a couple of times while I've been here, where you have people who are essentially shooting at a non-existent soccer goal and the ball's going over the fence and hitting a car or going out into the road where the student has to chase it. So providing some sort of screening is an option that we would really like to explore further. You have this sort of rhythm between the trees that line the western edge of the property, and considering sort of creating these vegetated screens in between them, and it's a very sort of effective visual tool, and it kind of gives you that opportunity of having both a barrier and something that you can also see through. We're not talking about something that would completely obscure all functions taking place on the other side, but rather something that would block things. The potential to create a really wonderful visual amenity, and even grow some food in this case, and have this sort of tactile sort of interaction with vines and climbers and things like that that are kind of integral to the proper introduction to horticulture and plant sciences. We came up with a lot of sort of, rather than fully fleshed out plans, we came up with some sort of schematic designs and tools to kind of communicate sort of what would be taking place. This is something I worked on a while ago up here that sort of documents like how you would approach this basketball court area without sort of disrupting the basketball function. Right now you've got an impervious area sort of crowned at the top, and so you've got all this water sort of going off in every single direction. And one way that you could deal with it, when we were talking about pervious concrete, the beauty of pervious concrete is not only that it allows this water to get into the ground, but it also provides almost kind of a subterranean means by which you can move the water around to the places that you want it to through subtle grading that takes place below the surface. So when looking at something like this, you have water flowing in the center, and if you were to put, say, a 5-foot wide sort of ring of pervious concrete around it, immediately you've got all that water going there, and then sort of moving through this material and then out to a place of your designation. In all likelihood, we're talking about the soccer field as being a potential place for storage and so forth. So, the idea is to create all of these individual sort of spaces with all of these individual functions, but still make sure that they all work together to create the sort of happy and sort of harmonious living system that is going to be the ideal sort of play place in general. We also toyed around with some more kind of extreme notions. This is particularly fleshed out, but nonetheless, perhaps we've been really kind of, it's hard not to look at the plan and think to yourself, well, you've got this field here and you've got this sort of L-shaped paved area elsewhere. Let's not mess with that. That's kind of the order of things, and we have to kind of stick to that and just improve things on this kind of phased level. However, we did do a couple of exercises where we just obliterated the current layout altogether. In terms of soccer, and it being the amenity, the field right now is obviously not of a regulation size by any means, although it's still great for younger players. But if you were to sort of rotate that 90 degrees, then you get a much larger space to potentially play in, and then you get a much more cohesive space to provide for all of your other functions. So we toyed around a lot. Goethe was one of the progenitors of plant morphology, as a matter of fact. So we were kind of trying to work in some themes related to Goethe himself, whether it be plant morphology. He was one of the fathers of modern color theory. So color is one of those things that we hope to really explore further in terms of how we can integrate that, because that's going to be one of the neater kind of connections that we can make to the namesake of the school. So the only, let's go forward. Yeah, this was a drawing I worked out, and this is kind of a more comprehensive look. It's colored, it's sexy, and so on and so forth. But really, have a look at what's actually taking place here. Up here in this quadrant over here, here's this sort of pervious ring that we were talking about. That could be essentially, we were saying that maybe it could go to the field, but we can daylight that water in sort of section here, so that water comes out, and you can have the opportunities that Mike was referring to perform sort of exercises with regards to sort of marsh habitats and so forth, and water quality. And that's something that'll be really great. We got these little bridges and things like that to keep kids falling in, but we have to kind of gauge whether or not that's really could be a safety hazard. Most of the time, if you've got standing water around, there's always the chance that somebody could drown. So we really have to look at that much more closely. This is another sort of really kind of unique approach up in this area that is kind of the idea of taking apart what pavement that we're going to keep on site, sort of breaking it up and then using it almost like pavers, extracting maybe 50% of it so you get gaps that you can then fill in with a much more sort of porous material that allows for the trees to sort of thrive in a manner that right now they're not really being given the opportunity to, these trees in the way that they're kind of choked out right now are not really going to be long for this world as we discussed. So the idea is to create a more, an environment that's a little bit more conducive to their health. And also, kind of closing this off to some degree, you have this is really kind of static space, so, creating a sort of series of benches that will ring the entire area for people who are either operating as spectators or whether or not they're just kind of looking for a break from the sort of rigors of the environment that's around them. We did respond, certainly a lot of you mentioned that you'd like to see a track. We've kind of worked that in here. Obviously, a 400-meter track is not something you can necessarily fit into this site, but it would be more reasonable to suggest that you could do something in the realm of 200 meters or something like that that wouldn't interfere. We'd be looking at less like, an Olympic track with lanes and more something like a path that corresponds to a certain distance that would allow an individual to sort of keep track of what they were doing. Obviously, we don't want to create too high traffic of an area going around here because you've got so many functions taking place in one area. And in terms of just kind of overall themes, like we said, we're messing around with this notion of plants. And so, you've got this, we begin kind of here at this north end where you've got this great south face and west face, which, is kind of also adjacent to some of the buildings that are to the north, which are kind of unsightly, especially, I'm really averse, I really loathe kind of chain link fences, and that's what's going on there. So anything that we can do to screen that is something that we definitely have to look into, but also because of that light and because of the fact that it's an area that doesn't undergo all that much use, I think you've got a perfect opportunity to sort of build that up, create sort of agricultural functions or even sort of forest edge communities, things like that that can become a pretty persuasive tool as far as it goes. And the sort of cornerstone of any type of operation like that would be a sort of outdoor teaching space, as denoted over here, where classes could convene, kind of go through the lesson, and then they would have access to this without really disturbing any of the other functions on site. So, it's kind of this idea of like, it's a field trip on the campus itself. So the further away you get from the school, the more you're sort of reminded that you're outside and that you're kind of doing something different, and you can reinforce a lot of positive behavior through immersing kids in the natural environment. So these are sort of paths that make their way through. Right now, it's like it's not a very cohesive space, and the manner in which people circulate through it and the sort of zones and so forth are kind of disorienting or non-existent at the moment. And this idea too, like, we didn't really want to get too heavy into actually designing play structures, but the idea that I had with this was to create these sort of leaf-like pads that would be at different heights and so forth, so that you've got this climbing opportunity, this scrambling opportunity, and then you integrate that with all of your sort of more traditional function slides and so forth, which were not necessarily included. In terms of shade, we were looking at these sort of faux tree aspects, which would be kind of like you take a rebar and you're starting a kind of central point and it spreads out and you get this sort of faux tree feeling right there that can provide a modicum of shade. And then continuing onward, you kind of repeating this leaf pattern throughout, and these we kind of envisioned as this being a gathering space right now. This outdoor area is a place where classes convene in the morning. They line up, they kind of take a stock of what's going on, and right now all there are just a couple of kind of crude numbers that are written and barely legible on the ground. So if you have these, and these become these sort of corresponding areas for an individual class, so that they know exactly where to go and where to kind of stay because they're bounded. One of the great things about pervious concrete, which will be just about every other surface beyond that which is vegetated, is that it is particularly conducive to painting and colors and whatnot, unlike like surface, like a parking lot, traditional parking lot with asphalt, where you've got the paint that is actually just on the surface and therefore is able to be worn away much easier. With pervious concrete, you're essentially staining the material. You are changing the actual composition of the material with color, so that does not go away. So we have the opportunity to put sort of permanent things on the ground, whether it be kind of the four square sort of functions, or whether it be hopscotch or anything else. We can even just do, the way that this was conceived is using those colors just to create these areas themselves. So I think we've got a real opportunity to create something that's durable and long-lasting, and that really looks towards the future as far as it goes. Obviously, maintenance is one of those issues that we're much concerned about, and issues of maintenance really do kind of center around this notion of the soccer field, because there is this, we heard a lot of people saying artificial turf, and we as sort of ecological designers obviously have some misgivings about artificial turf. There are some studies that suggest that it's even more absorptive in terms of heat than asphalt itself. I have a couple of papers where they've done heat readings and temperatures got up to 165 degrees. However, it is relatively durable, but in terms of other kind of, to demystify these notions of it being maintenance-free, I'd really like to take that opportunity, because it's not a maintenance-free process. You have to clean it, and you have to water it, and you have to do a number of items in order to keep that going, and frankly, it's just not as pleasing as real grass, and we have a real opportunity here to explore some very, underutilized sort of methods, and primarily involving structural soil buildup, so that we can create an ideal playing space that can deal with anything you can throw at it, whether you're putting 800 people there for an 8th grade graduation event, or whether you're running soccer all day and all night, and you install the proper subbase that is able to handle that compaction, able to foster the proper root zone to grow that grass, then it's not something that can be worn out. People really tend to think the more use you have, if you have a tremendous amount of use, then you're inevitably going to break the field down. But if you put in the legwork initially, then you have the opportunity to have a field that will be long-lasting, attractive, graded properly, and God willing, we might have the opportunity here to use the area beneath the field to actually store the water that will water the field. But we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, because there is some talk that potentially there could be a donation of a play surface from Nike using some of the recycled material that they're so prone to giving out these days. And obviously, if somebody comes along with a material like that and it doesn't have a price tag attached to it, then that's an option that we're going to have to look at. And certainly too, we've been talking about how it's already a small field, so we're looking at 7-on-7 games, but then you can kind of switch it up and run it east-west like that, get 5 on the side, and I think that the school really would have an opportunity to lease it out, or I don't know what the term is when you describe something like that, whereby somebody else comes in, but this would be a really great surface and a great opportunity to run clinics, small 5-a-side scrimmages, even little, like you could do annual tournaments and things like that. So obviously this is a non-binding sort of drawing, but nonetheless, this is the sort of opportunities that we have. These are the sort of options that we can bring to the table, and this is all surprisingly realistic, despite the sort of fantastical notions of some of this stuff. Like, it's certainly within reach. So we have